I would like to start with a short introduction. First of all, interestingly, when, I already gave a presentation about 3 years ago here about the first book which had been published. And, since that I started to teach at the University of Miami, more or less linked to the publication of the first book. And one could have expected that I would have had much more opportunities actually to make speeches and to discuss the topics in the wider public that I'm interested in. Now, funnily enough, and it's somehow absurd for a professor, is that what happens is that you have to constantly, prepare papers for conferences, and you're supposed to go much more into depth. That you're working much more on details of a larger issue rather than actually trying to talk about, the wider implications, if possible, even with a public which is not necessarily a public of professionals. So, these kind of occasions, funnily enough, have become more rare, and I'm quite happy tonight just to talk essentially about the content of the book itself, rather than to address one specific topic, which could be participation, which could be finance of real estate or whatever. So I'm very happy to do this. Before I forget it, a very special thanks to Stanhope. Essentially, the research work that I have underdone together with co-authors and a little team of people who have helped us has been sponsored by private and public developers or development companies. So Stanhope has been one of them, so was involved in the first book about housing typologies and in this one. And I would like to give special thanks because Stanhope also has paid for big parts of the flight ticket coming from Miami over to here, so something that should not be forgotten. Thanks also, once again, I mentioned already the presentation 3 years ago here at the Urban Design Group. Thanks for filming it, to put it on the internet. I think that's quite helpful for the marketing of the book and in order to generate a discussion which otherwise could very quickly become forgotten. Before we jump right away into the book itself and some slides about the preceding books, I would like to make comments which, again, are quite important. First of all, this book has been written together with a German planner called Katharina Grön. She now lives and works in Handbook and has also studied there. She works as a planner. Afterwards, the second point are the limitations of the content. So, as I said, that's quite important. I would not like to leave the impression that the examples that you will see here are somehow the mirror of the only way of doing urban development. So what we did, if we would like to present a comparative study of urban planning, then we should choose projects which have something in common. So most of the projects that we'll see now are actually about a large-scale approach, sometimes starting with a large scale and then being subdivided into smaller plots. But essentially we have projects which are sometimes cases even of tabula rasa, or of brownfield redevelopment, but they are just, showing one way of doing urban development. Another one would be more going into strategies, trying actually to get small-scale development going, often in an existing urban fabric. So the city is actually trying to somehow get development going without necessarily buying up most plots of land or reselling them. So what you will see here is mainly addressing the larger scale approach, right? The one that we see today, for example, in the Olympic Legacy projects, right? Because there wasn't so much existing structure, at least for some parts of those fields. I also believe that the book comes at a fairly right moment. You will hear the word process very often tonight. I think that process has to be understood in the wider sense. I think for me it has a lot to do with what you would call evidence-based urban design or figure-based urban design. We have gathered also for all those 20 examples in the books, we have compared density figures, we have compared the size as such, as much as we could. And I believe that's the tendency that we're going to have more and more in the future. So if an urban designer really would like to be successful in the future and try to understand a tendency actually to have an ever stronger marketing of urban projects, I believe it is very helpful to actually understand what sits behind the design which is actually implemented. I think there's a strong tendency from architects actually to just criticize or to look at the implemented architecture, or even at the urban design in terms of sidewalks or urban spaces, but to forget how all this actually has grown over time. So that's something that I believe will become stronger and stronger in the future. So now I was about to start, and it's already over. I guess we have to. I don't have the password. Can we pop that down there? Okay, so that's the cover. Thank you. That's the cover of the book I would like to talk about. This was more or less the cover of the first book. So as you can recognize, it's the same publisher. It's also essentially it grew into a series, and I would like to tell this story not only for marketing reasons, to mention the two other books, also because they are part of this series, but because the three books are very much linked, and the process questions that I'm going to talk about tonight actually have grown over time and have become more and more important. And my somehow thesis is that this has to do with a question of scale, right? If you're just looking at one single building, then it's fair enough to have a very formal approach. But once you're going into larger buildings, and that's what the second book is about Highrise, or if you go into urban plans, a strictly formal approach becomes almost an absurdity. And so I would just show very quickly some of the examples. These obviously are not pages. These are just copy-paste elements of some of the visuals being in those books. So what we did, we made a selection of 30 housing types from all over the world. So this was also a repetitive scheme in the three books, actually, to work completely on an international base and to work consistently also on cross-historic base. So, as you can see here, so we have a famous example of typology which was born in the late second part of the 19th century in Barcelona. This is the Eixample, I think that's the word, Masterplanning by Cerdà. And, what we did is just, we were always showing areas at the same scale, redrawing half of it at the double scale here as an urban plan. We were doing the urban sections. So a lot of material which is somehow very straightforward, but on the other hand, very difficult to find. And luckily it has found a certain amount of interest. So we have also, we went into archives here in Barcelona just trying to find the buildings which were expressing, the type in a relatively pure case. So here that's, the typical section of one of those Barcelona apartment buildings. What you can see is, interestingly enough, the ground floor has mainly been built up in the center of the courtyard. So there is no real courtyard in those huge blocks. And what's interesting in terms of development history is actually that Cerdà, the famous Cerdà, was able to implement almost the totality of his urban design. So that's the competition entry, but if you look now at an aerial of Barcelona, essentially the reality looks the same as his competition entry. But what you can see here is that his architectural ideas were completely different from what has been implemented. So he just wanted, in most cases, to build up only two sides of the block, the two other sides remaining open, and the center actually being some kind of green park. Now that's something that the developers didn't find that convincing, and actually they decided, rather to build on a far higher density, not only 3 levels on two sides, but actually about 5, 6, 7 levels all around the block. And you can see here, that's the view from the terraces of a first floor apartment. So actually the terraces are going above the element that I was just showing in the section before. So a density which is extremely high, and you can see here the architectural consequences. Actually the apartments do need air shafts in the middle, because otherwise you would have half of the apartment being completely dark. So here again we have a strong relationship between the development logic of this case, which again, I don't have the time to go into details, and the architecture which has evolved out of it. So obviously it wouldn't make any sense just to criticize the fact that those air shafts are not the most exciting spaces on Earth. But, there's a logic why that is. And, that's one of the few exceptions which Serdar already had in mind, which have actually been implemented, are those kind of smaller family row houses which are going through the middle of some of the blocks, but they're quite rare. And we see here, that was the concept of the first book, actually to compare the mainly traditional style. So most of these 30 examples were 19th century examples. Some of them were vernacular. For example, we have courtyard houses from Marrakesh, or we have tower houses from Sanaa, which obviously are not 19th century, but going up much, much higher and much earlier in time. So here we have a contemporary case found by the cause of this book, Caroline Stahl, who is a German architect from Berlin, who has been working several years for famous practices in Paris, like Edouard François or Lacaton Vassal, and now works actually for David Chipperfield in Berlin. And she found contemporary case studies which had something in common with the traditional one. So here she was actually finding a building from Buenos Aires where the architects were kind of trying to find a solution for this problem of the density of the block and the problem that I was talking about here. So if you want to make it viable, you need a very deep floor plan, right? And if you have this deep floor plan, you have the problem of the center. So what the architects did here is quite interesting. First of all, they made the center quite obviously much larger, so they have a much better light quality. But what they also did is they transformed them into duplexes, and they did not follow the typical 19th century logic anymore, which prescribed necessarily a view towards the street for all the apartments. That's why the apartments here had to be so deep, because it was impossible to cut them into two. The apartment in the back would have had half the value because everybody wanted the view. Now today, with all the traffic noises, traffic problems that we have in the modern city and also in Buenos Aires, it's not necessarily the apartment which is looking on the street does not necessarily have more value than the apartment which is calmer, looking towards the courtyard. And we find it quite interesting, how you see the development of typologies based on the change of our cities and how we live in it. And here you see that was actually it was a key factor. The structure of the book was actually organized according to density figures. So first we made a classification of typologies, courtyard houses, row houses, the first one being one family, and compounds and apartment buildings being multifamily. And we recalculated different density figures. So the habitable rooms per hectare we thought is actually the most important one, because if we are going back to traditional examples, it doesn't somehow really make sense to calculate how many units do we have today, because what we can do, we can renovate them and cut them in different units. But the habitable rooms say a lot about what you could still do today. And you can see here, for example, the Barcelona case, the Casa de Renta, which you have just seen, is actually one of the densest, just second after, an area in the Upper East Side in New York that we took as an example of the early residential tower. Talking about towers, so most of those examples in the first book are actually, except of one, they are all low and mid-rise at the maximum. And, we started to become interested in the mid and the high-rise. So actually towers is slightly exaggerated. We just needed to find, kind of a catchy title. And so we called it the Urban Towers Handbook. But at the end of the day, many examples are rather about mid-rise and high-rise, just pushing it slightly further. And what we realized is once you start to push it slightly further, the whole development logic and the impact that it has on the city and the way you plan the city starts to change. So, those were issues we were very much interested in, and that's where already the process topic became much more important than for the first book, where essentially everybody was remaining in a small envelope, right? Everybody was following very clear-cut rules, like in the Barcelona example, right? Like each developer was essentially never directly repeating the building, but he was following exactly the same type, and he didn't have to think so much about, the impact that had on the exterior, right? Because this impact had already been predefined for thousands of examples. For the tower, these logics changed very much so. And for this book, I worked together with Julie Gimbal, who is a French art historian, not an architect. And she just finished now at the Sorbonne her PhD about the history of high-rise in France. So there was quite an interesting collaboration. We again made different classifications. We had 3 parts of the book. The first one is some kind of a morphological ABC of high-rise. So we had freestanding single interventions. The Gherkin could be one example, which we put into the classification, the monument in the block, because the Gherkin is freestanding, but it is in a fairly dense context. And the second group, morphological group, would have been groups of interventions, so several towers being built at the same time. And the third group were high-rise cities, one of those very few. At the end of the day, as we know, there's no real high-rise city, but you have some cities which have big parts of their area being built up with a mid and high-rise typology. So here we actually, once again, what's very important, we are trying to find very different examples. Not all of them, or many of them, are not meant to be best practice. That's the case for all the 3 books, particularly for the one about high-rise, and sometimes also even for the one about master planning. So here we have actually a type of intervention which was quite typical for construction in the Parisian banlieue, which went, from the 60s, 70s up to the beginning of the 80s. And that's here, I think, a project from around the mid-70s, Quartier du Palais in Créteil, which is one of the suburbs of Paris, close to your university. Quite typical, actually, atypical in terms of architectural implementation. I find it quite interesting, the way the architect was trying to use those concrete balconies as an extension of the fairly small interiors of the apartments. But on the other hand, there's also something very typical about what you could call those grands ensembles. There was the official name of this type of development, very similar to what happened also in the London suburbs. This kind of social housing, mass housing developments. And you can see this, the content essentially is social housing, so you have a monofunctional use. You are in the suburbs, built on cheap land. And once again, what's interesting already in terms of process, I think one of the reasons, as, kind of innovative this architecture might be, the slight boredom of, the urban design as such, which is some kind of a 3D pattern, comes also from the fact that the setup of those projects was extremely simple. So essentially we have a social housing authority which is just choosing an architect who is at the same time landscape architect and urban designer. So I think at the end of the day, sometimes we are looking at those mass housing examples and criticizing the architecture, I do believe it has a lot to do with how those projects have been set up. And obviously I'm not saying anything new, but I think it's still worthwhile repeating it. And you see even a gifted architect like this one, I think his name is Gérard Grandval, I think it's about 85 still working, quite impressive. He's actually still dreaming that they're going to implement what he wanted to do right at the beginning, which is very innovative even for today. The idea is actually that plants would be growing up those balconies. So I don't know how reasonable that is to implement, but this was actually, it was a green tower even in the 70s. So it's quite, he's definitely a talented architect, but somehow limited in terms of, the choice of program that was chosen. And here, the concept here was to have secondary examples for each of these classes. And so it's the classes, some type of 3D pattern. We have here funnily enough, that's a project by Riken Yamamoto, which is called Janmai Soho, has been published many times, many of you will know it. And it's actually part of the Beijing CBD, which is one example, which I'm not going to show tonight, but one example of the master plan book. And the same is actually the case for Stuyvesant Town. It's funny that I choose this by chance, but there's a direct link between the two books. And I like, to a certain extent, how the Japanese architect here is playing with the image of the white modernist tower, but at the end of the day, very repetitive, very clear cut. But it's kind of a Miesian, Corbusian mixture. But if you're looking at the fairly complicated ground floor, with a lot of shop use, a lot of restaurants, you actually realize that they were able today to implement a very different type of urban strategy, which is actually quite successful. So I think those buildings have a certain building problem and apparently like a fairly rapidly decreasing quality of the interior spaces, but the urban design is very successful. And Stuyvesant Town, I'm going to talk about it a bit later. It's a famous example of the tower in park typology, quite similar to what we were showing in Créteil, and mostly monofunctional, even not totally. And another example here was one of the few cases lesser known of the high-rise cities. So Hong Kong was one example, Houston as a typical example of a US downtown, even Monaco. This is probably the least famous, is Higienópolis, is a quarter in Sao Paulo. And we found it quite fascinating to see how a residential area, so all those plots here actually were initially marketed, and that's where the name Higienópolis comes from, as a family villa district, right? So these were just small villas on each plot. And interestingly, the plot structure didn't change that much, but over time, those buildings were just getting taller and taller, ending up, many of them being 40 levels tall, and funnily enough, also always remaining, keeping their high real estate value. So Higienópolis is a downtown area of Sao Paulo, which actually is an expensive quarter until now, and unlike some other areas, has hardly ever lost values, which is surprising if you look, it's not necessarily what you would imagine to be a very successful example of high-rise urban design, but somehow it looks like the people living there are very happy. Just to finish, and again, I'm spending already too much time actually not the actual topic of this presentation, but very interesting if you're thinking about the history of high-rise architecture, specifically in Europe, started more or less at the same time as modernism and its egalitarian ideas. So it's very difficult actually to find a high-rise floor plan where you would recognize a clear social differentiation. But here, in South America, where the society also socially tends to be slightly different from the one that we had in Europe, or that, at least for which we designed and built high-rise buildings, we actually have here towers which have a clear separation between service rooms on the north and the larger master rooms on the southwest and east. So you have 2 apartments here on each floor and several rooms actually just being for service personnel. It's something that is, for me, hardly known for the European tower, quite interesting from a historic and social point of view. This looks more actually like a Parisian apartment building from the 19th century. And I'm going to show some plans afterwards. And I mention all this once again because we realize we can't treat the high-rise issue in the same way as the low and mid-rise, because the impact that we have on the surroundings is much more important, and that's why many cities actually need fairly complex building regulations in order to use the development dynamics of mid and high-rise for the, if possible, best of the future of everybody living in those cities. So what Julie did, actually, she chose 7 cities worldwide. That's an example of Frankfurt, and was trying to explain how the city, that's showing existing and future high-rise buildings on an existing area of the city. And here some of the plans that we received from the city planning departments. We met with all those people, and they were just explaining to us how, the way how high-rise was meant to be planned around the historic core here of Frankfurt has changed several times. So initially the idea was to have the towers around the former gates, on the glacis here. Then afterwards there was the idea of a finger plan, so the towers would go out like fingers. And then, what essentially was implemented was, this cluster idea, which Frankfurt now is quite famous for. It never completely works. It's quite interesting. Once you have a developer who really wants to build somewhere else, often he gets his way. But that's an interesting struggle, and maybe it also has a certain logic. Even the Coop Himmelblau building the European Bank is actually not in one of those areas which had been defined as the high-rise clusters, which I find quite somehow ironic as a public building. And here one of the models. And we finished with, we were also worked with a French engineer who had been has been working for, or still working for WSP Group. He's the director of the Paris office and had been working in New York, London, and now in Paris on several high-rise projects. Actually, I'm quite happy because apparently also through this book, he is able now to work on the Rogers Nouvelle, a master plan for, I forgot what area in Paris, which is meant to be built up partly with towers. And here he was writing about the implication of sustainability. Again, you know, the whole idea about this book was to go away from the vision of the architectural superlative and the financial and the engineering structural one, but rather to see it as part of the urban fabric. Now, if you make a sustainability analysis, you find out that until today, the different ways of how to gather energy through high-rise construction is still not, you know, paying off the enormous energy effort to build high-rise and to maintain it. So even if we have solar collectors, if we have wind collectors, I think these are great technologies, and I think they will evolve more and more with time, but we still can't gain more energy than we have put into the building, and that we need for AC and whatever. So the real rationale of high-rise and even mid-rise is actually to implement higher densities, because it's through higher densities that we can use the energy. You know, this diagram is actually showing how energy which is used, for example, for office during the day can be used for residential by night, or vice versa. So, you know, all those technological energy examples and examples of best practice are much easier to implement in high densities. So also if, you know, the whole issue of trying to avoid sprawl in actually trying to accumulate higher densities in the city center, it's something which we should try to do with high-rise, which at the end of the day is quite rarely the case. So actually, if we are looking at some of those density figures that we again have recalculated, so these are the FARs. FARs means how many times do we accumulate the surface of the plot on the whole surface being built in the tower. So we can see that an example like, you know, even I have Torre Velasca, you know, which is quite a beautiful historic example, which is not bad in terms of FAR. We are almost at 6. The Commerzbank by Foster in Frankfurt is almost 11. St. Mariax, the Gherkin, is pretty good, over 8, because it's in a very dense context, so it's using its site fairly well. Now, you see this here? The Quartier du Palais, that's the example that I was showing you in the Parisian banlieue. So you see the density of that? So if we are talking about sustainability, there can't be any kind of sustainability rationale to build those towers. Doesn't mean that you're necessarily against them, so I don't want to, you know, simplify those kind of discussions, but there is no density rationale if you're looking at that. Very famous also for, you know, I think many of you will be pretty strong in architectural history, so you will know the Hansa-Viertel in Berlin, started in 1958 as some kind of a competitor to the Karl-Marx-Allee in East Berlin by Henselmann. And again, one of the most famous examples of kind of partly high-rise architecture. And here I was only calculating the high-rise part of this area. You know, I think there were also famous, for example, Alvar Aalto has built there a building which is maybe just 8 stories tall or maybe less. So I'm not even considering this. I'm considering the 5 towers which are more or less high-rise. I don't remember how many stories they have, but it's probably written somewhere here. And we are at a density of less than 2. So I think this actually tells us a story which is quite interesting. So to build, we just had this discussion before, but to build densities with high-rise which are denser than, for example, central Paris is something which is very rarely done. It's very difficult to establish, and that's why I believe that we need much more also academic discussion and studies about how to use mid and high-rise in a way which makes urban sense, and that's a discussion, unfortunately, that we have quite rarely. I lost a lot of time, so let's jump now into some of those 20 examples in the Urban Master Planning Handbook.